So the National Church Life Survey did a survey years ago. This is 2011 data. It showed that in existing churches, 6% of people weren't in church 5 years ago. When we did a study in 2016 of the church plants in Australia, one of the things that we found was that same figure was 33%. It's 5 times more effective in a church plant environment in those first few years than in established churches. Welcome to the first episode of the Planting Australia podcast from Geneva Push. My co-host Madeline Galea, who I'll introduce you to in a second. If this is the first time you're joining us on a Geneva Push podcast or a Reach Australia podcast, it's great to have you here. The purpose of this podcast is to help you think through whether it is you could plant a church, whether you should plant a church, whether you could join a church plant. Our vision is to see hundreds of churches evangelised into existence across Australia. Our hope is that through those churches, those who don't know Jesus come to know Jesus. And so this podcast is designed to help you think through those questions and provide a framework and hopefully conversation pieces and connections that you can have with people to work through that question. But before we start, let me introduce you to my co-host, Madeline Galea. Madeline has been part of church plants her entire life, actually. She grew up in a church plant in Western Sydney, multicultural Bible ministry, some which I'm sure she can't remember, she was so young, but lots of which she does. She's now at a church plant called Grace City in Sydney, Australia. So she's got a wealth of experience in being part of a church plant. Her role now as well, she works with Geneva Push in the recruit and the assess area, helping people who are thinking through church planting think well and wisely into whether they should do that, whether they could do that, and what that might look like. So welcome, Maddie.
Thanks for having me. This is Derek Hanna. In case you don't know him, he is my boss, but more so he planted a church in Brisbane, and then in 2016, he joined Geneva Push and is now the general manager and oversees all of Geneva Push and keeps us on track with church planting. So thanks for having.
Great to be here.
Yeah. So as we kick off this series, we're going to start by thinking through, do we really need to be church planting? Every church began as a church plant, and with several established churches all across Australia, some with vacancies and needing more ministers, more gospel workers. The question we really want to start with is, why do we need more church plants? Why should we be church planting? And we have a few reasons today which we're going to unpack. So I'll hand it over to you.
So this is a key question because a lot of time people are thinking through, we do have a separate church which is vacant, so why plant? Let me give you 3 reasons for church planting. If you've been in and around Geneva Push at all, you'll have heard some of these reasons, but they are compelling reasons and we need to keep reminding ourselves of them. The first one is this, and it feels like a motherhood statement, this, no one's going to disagree with this, but the first reason is this: people desperately need the gospel in Australia. People desperately need the gospel. If we take optimistic figures about what church attendance is like, there's around 5% of people in Bible-believing churches across Australia. 5%. With Australia's population ticking towards a 25 million mark, that leaves about 23 or so million people who don't know Jesus, who aren't in those churches. There are more churches closing in Australia than there are opening each year. For many Australians, Christianity is associated with narrow-minded moralism. The church is haunted by past failures, people who it should have cared for that it didn't, and Christians have gone the defensive. There's a bunker mentality there. For many as well, the rise of secularism and the apathy that a comfortable life brings in Australia has dulled them to what they would see as the need for the gospel, wondering whether they can just live life without God, without spirituality. And there's been a growing establishment, a growing societal norm that promotes unexamined tolerance as the basis for our interaction. We don't push back on anything, we don't push into anything, we just accept. And that has led to some church leaders and some churches winding back an evangelistic urgency, winding back the offensiveness of the gospel sometimes, and the controversial aspects of the gospel. But proclaiming the gospel is inherently offensive to me, to everyone who's not in a relationship with God. but we have descended at points in church to just an acceptance that we can rebel against the creator of the world and things will be okay. Look, that's the first reason. There is a desperately urgent need for the gospel in Australia. Yeah.
And because even with the complexities, I guess, of our culture now, people are broken and people need, they still need an answer to why they exist, to the brokenness of the world. They need the truth. And yeah, people need Jesus now. It's not that they need him more now than they did previously. The lost has always been the lost, you're either with Jesus or without. But it's becoming harder for people to know someone who's a born-again Christian, to have a local church in their area that they can go to.
Absolutely. More people from more nations with less exposure to the gospel in Australia. It is a matter of gospel urgency. And now, this is not controversial. I don't think, I'm sure for lots of people in Australia who don't know Jesus, this would be controversial. But for Christians, what we've just said here is not controversial, but it is worth articulating because it's the groundwork for, in fact, this whole podcast series, but the whole work of Geneva Push and Reach Australia in trying to reach Australia. But here's the second reason, and this does push into church planting. New churches are more effective at reaching new people. New churches are more effective at reaching new people. There are things that church plants can do that existing churches, the established church, find it hard to do. Church plants are often the R&D department of the church ecosystem. There's more freedom to try things, more freedom to innovate, less inhibitions, less risk for them in trying things as well. More risk in other ways, but in trying new things, there's more freedom often to fail because there is less risk to the overall system of the church. The new things that church plants try sometimes work. A lot of times they don't, but sometimes they work and they find their way back into the existing churches with the kinks having been ironed out and tried out in that safe space. And it ends up renewing and refreshing church practice throughout the whole ecosystem.
Yeah. It makes sense. You want to start a new ministry where you've got 50 people in your congregation, try that same thing with 500, the risk is just a lot higher.
Absolutely. Yep, that's right. But look, that's not the primary reason in that space, but it is a key thing to recognise. Church plants can try new things. The central reason for church planting here is not just to outsource creativity to a safe space. The central reason for church planting is because new churches more effectively reach people who don't know Jesus. Whether they've drifted away from the church, whether they've never had anything to do with the church, it more effectively engages them. So the National Church Life Survey did a survey years ago. It's 2011 data. It showed that in existing churches, 6% of people weren't in church 5 years ago. So they were either de-churched, that is, they drifted away, or they'd never had anything to do with church, they were unchurched. When we did a study in 2016 of the church plant in Australia, one of the things that we found was that same figure was 33%. It's 5 times more effective in a church plant environment in those first few years than in established churches. The second reason to plant church is not just to outsource creativity, although that is a side benefit of it, an important one. The secondary reason is this: it's a biblical and effective strategy for reaching those people who don't know Jesus. It is one of the most effective strategies we can have, and it's a biblical strategy. If we're going to reach Australia, then we have to plant. Planting is not optional in this.
Yeah. So we've got the first reason, which is the 23 million in Australia who don't know Jesus, so there is a need. Church plants, secondly, are more effective at reaching the lost. And what is our third reason? All right,
here's a third one. This question of whether you strengthen existing churches or you plant new churches, they don't have to be in competition. And in fact, they shouldn't be in competition. In fact, what we've realised in the Geneva Push and the Reach Australia network for both planting and establishing, these two things go hand in hand. If you're going to have a healthy gospel ecosystem, you need both. It's not an either-or question. It's a both-and question. We must do both. There are more than enough lost people to go around. And we cannot be precious about our patch. The thing we must treasure is the plight of the lost without Jesus, and we must be convicted. about their eternal destiny and not about our legacy. And so since Australia is in such dire need of the gospel, we should pursue all biblical avenues to reach the lost, all of them. And so we do need to strengthen existing churches, and Reach Australia is doing that as well within this movement. But we also need to plant new churches alongside that without being precious. We need to see healthy, multiplying, evangelistic churches that have an urgency to reach the lost. And therefore we need to plant more churches. We need to. Ultimately, under God, church plants are the most effective tools for reaching the lost. So we need to do that without neglecting existing churches. But let me keep banging on, because this is a church planting podcast. So I want to keep banging on about that. You can listen to podcasts around established churches, and they will say equally as important things, but around reaching the lost, church planting plays a vital part in the ecosystem.
So if you were going to plant a church, where would you go? Who has no viable gospel witness? Where needs a church plant? And where needs a church that is not a cruise ship but a lifeboat? Join us for episode 2 as we discuss and help you think through whether you should be a church planter. Go to genevapush.com/planting Australia.
You feel good to do cat-cows?
He's really gotten into the gym. It's really... It's really,
I normally do yoga this morning. I couldn't do that.
Welcome to Church Planting Australia podcast. I don't know why I don't have that down. Church Planting Australia. It's logical.